There are stories that were never meant to reach you. It's not because they were classified, not because they were invented, but because the people who lived through them made a quiet, private decision, usually in the weeks and months after it happened, to carry what they knew in silence for the rest of their lives, because silence was the only available container for something that language was not built to hold. Tonight, for reasons each of these 5 people arrived at separately and differently, those stories are no longer silent. 5 accounts. 5 moments where the world cracked open in a direction no one was standing in front of and ready for. You are about to hear all 5. Whatever happens after, that's on you. You were warned. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. What I want you to understand before we begin is this. The 5 people in tonight's accounts are not extraordinary. They're not ghost hunters, not paranormal investigators, not people who sought out dark places or strange experiences or the friction that comes from deliberately pushing your life into contact with the unknown. They are a maritime archivist working a research contract, a forensic sketch artist doing her job in an ordinary county precinct, a museum security guard on a standard overnight shift, a telephone infrastructure technician doing routine maintenance in a rural county, a hospice nurse who chose her profession because she wanted to be useful at the moment people needed it most. Ordinary professional people doing ordinary professional work. In the kinds of environments we pass through and depend on every day without a second thought until the day those environments stopped behaving the way they were supposed to. Each of these 5 stories begins in a place you would recognize: a lighthouse archive, a police precinct art room, a Victorian gallery, a rural junction box, a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. Each of them reaches a moment, one specific. Irreversible moment, where the ordinary thing they were looking at became something they could not look away from and could not explain and have not been able to explain since. We are going into all 5 tonight without stopping. If you are somewhere alone, good. So that is the right condition for what you are about to hear. If you are new to True Terror Files Official, welcome. We post every single night. Something is always waiting. Tonight, 5 things waited a very long time for someone to finally listen. Let's begin. Marina Holt was 34 years old and 3 months into a maritime archiving contract with a regional coastal preservation authority when she was assigned the Pelican Rock Lighthouse documentation project, which was the kind of assignment that sounded more atmospheric than it was in practice. A decommissioned lighthouse built in 1891 on a sea stack 2 miles off the northern coast. Automated in 1963, fully decommissioned and sealed in 1988, its equipment removed and its access restricted since then, with the documentation contract requiring nothing more exotic than a 2-hour boat transfer to the site, a thorough photographic survey of the interior condition, and the retrieval of any original logbooks or operational records still present in the structure before the authority completed its ownership transfer to a private conservation trust. Marina had done 11 of these contracts across 4 years and found them methodical and uncomplicated and occasionally beautiful in the particular way of things that have been left alone long enough to develop a relationship. With her own decay, the rust patterns on cast iron, the specific quality of light through glass that has 40 years of salt accumulation on it, the way a space that once required constant human attention sits in total silence and seems to understand that its purpose has concluded. Pelican Rock was in slightly better structural condition than the briefing documents had indicated, which she noted in her site survey, and the lamp room and watch room were intact enough to photograph thoroughly. And in the watch room, the small room, directly below the lamp apparatus, where the keeper on duty would sit through their watch. She found what she had come for, a wooden crate beneath the main desk containing 41 operational logbooks spanning the lighthouse's inhabited period from 1891 to 1963, stacked in rough chronological order, cloth-covered and damp-warped, but largely legible. She photographed the crate's contents in situ, boxed the books individually in the archival tissue she had brought for exactly this purpose, and was preparing to transfer the box to her equipment bag when she noticed a 40-second book that had not been visible in the crate. A slim volume, different from the others in that its cover was not cloth but a dark oilskin that had survived the decades in considerably better condition than its companions. She pulled it out. The spine was unmarked. Inside cover had no operational header. No station designation, no keeper name, standard features in every operational logbook she had ever processed. She opened it to the first entry. The date at the top of the page was September 14th, 1988, 11 months after decommissioning. 7 months after the official seal date, meaning whoever wrote this entry had been inside the sealed lighthouse after its closure to all authorized personnel. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, and recorded observations in the format of a lighthouse log time. Weather conditions, sea state. Visibility as though the operational function of the building was still intact, still necessary, still being maintained by someone who had not received the decommissioning notice, or had received it and chosen to disregard it. Marina read through 6 entries spanning September to November of 1988, all identical in format, all recording sea conditions and passing vessel observations on a schedule that matched the old watch rotation the lighthouse had used during its operational decades. There was no identification of the writer anywhere in the 6 entries. There was no indication of how they were accessing a sealed structure. There was nothing inherently disturbing about the 6 entries beyond their impossible existence. Someone had been keeping watch in a sealed lighthouse, alone at the edge of the sea, for at least 3 months after the building's official closure, and had done so with the complete procedural calm of someone who believed the watch still mattered. Marina turned to the 7th entry. The date was November 23rd, 1988. The weather observation and sea state were recorded in the same careful hand. Then, beneath the standard notation, was a single additional line that had not appeared in any of the prior 6 entries, a line written in a different pressure, a slightly different angle of the letters, as though the hand that wrote it was working more carefully, or working more quickly, or working in a state that was different from the methodical calm of the preceding text. It read, "There is a vessel approaching from the northeast. Registry markings match no active record. It has been sitting at the outer marker for 4 hours. When the light moves over it, no one is on deck." Marina photographed the page. She photographed every page. She transferred the book with the others and completed the site survey and took the boat back to the mainland without telling the boat operator what she had found, because she had not yet determined what she had found. Which was still true when she reached the authorities' archive office, and true when she sat with the digitized photographs of the 40-second logbook across the following 3 days, cross-referencing the vessel observation entries against the maritime incident records from 1988, and finding 3 separate entries that corresponded to actual reported incidents on the dates and coordinates documented. In the book Weather Events Debris Fields, a vessel that had issued a distress signal and been found adrift, meaning whoever had kept this log had been watching the sea and recording what happened on it with accuracy. From inside a sealed building, using a light that had been officially extinguished, She reported the 40-second logbook to the authorities' records director and was told the discrepancy would be noted and the book would undergo provenance analysis. 3 weeks later, the records director told her the book had been classified as a probable fabrication introduced into the archive at some point after initial survey, and that its contents did not correspond to any verified record of post-decommissioning access to the Pelican Rock site. Marina asked about the incident correlations. The director said the correlations were coincidental. Marina said she understood. She has the photographs of every page on an external drive she keeps in her desk. She opens the file occasionally and reads the final entry. The one after the vessel with the blank deck sitting at the outer marker. The entry that she did not mention to the records director because she does not know how to mention it in a way that produces a useful response. The final entry is dated November 24th, 1988. It records standard weather conditions and sea state. And below them, in the same altered pressure of the previous night's final line, it reads, "I have been on watch here for 31 years. I do not know when the relief keeper is coming. I have begun to understand that I should not wait at the window after dark because the light does not show you only what is on the water. Sometimes it shows you what is looking back. Celeste Rowe had been a certified forensic composite artist for 9 years, working part-time under contract for 3 county sheriff's departments in central Georgia, and had developed over those 9 years a specific and deliberate compartmentalization between the work she did in interview rooms, sitting across from witnesses in the controlled description into visual form, and the rest of her life, because the work required her to internalize a great deal of fear from other people and then convert it into something clinical and transferable, and the only way to do that sustainably was to leave it in the room where it happened. She was good at the work in the way that required both technical skill and a particular kind of emotional intelligence. The ability to ask a frightened person to look carefully at a face they were trying not to think about, and to stay present with them in the discomfort of that looking until the image that came out of it was accurate and usable. She was also, as a creative practice, entirely separate from her forensic work. An artist, specifically a journal artist, keeping a visual diary in a large sketchbook she had maintained for 11 years with the casual consistency of someone who had long since stopped thinking of it as a discipline and simply did it the way other people made coffee in the morning. Faces were her primary subject. Strangers in coffee shops, family members at holidays. Composite method exercises she ran on herself to stay sharp during slow contract periods. Portraits of no one in particular assembled from imagination. She had filled 22 sketchbooks across 11 years and had never once found anything in them that she did not recognize as her own deliberate work, which is what made the discovery in Sketchbook 23 so disorienting in its specificity. She had been keeping the book since January of that year and was approximately 4 months in when she accepted a composite assignment from the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office, a home invasion case, 2 witnesses. The assailant, described as a white male in his 40s with specific and consistent facial features that both witnesses confirmed independently. Standard work. She conducted both interviews on a Thursday, completed the composite to the witnesses' satisfaction by Friday afternoon, submitted it to the department by Friday evening. On Saturday morning, she was working on a new journal entry and flipped back through the current sketchbook to reference a technique she had used in an earlier page, and she stopped. On the page dated February 9th, 11 weeks before the composite interview she had completed 2 days earlier, there was a face. Her face in the sense that her hand had drawn it. She knew her own line weight, her own proportion habits, the specific way she built a jaw from reference angles. A middle-aged white male, strongly rendered. The kind of careful observational work she produced when she had been sitting with a subject long enough to internalize the structure of the face rather than just its surface. She did not recognize drawing it. This was not unusual. She produced journal work in a light dissociative state that was the productive byproduct of 11 years of practice, and she sometimes found pages she had no clear memory of making. What was unusual was the face. She pulled out the composite she had submitted to the department. She put it beside the sketchbook. She looked at both images for a long time in the specific, structural way her training had given her, the cephalic index. The orbital depth, the zygomatic width, the Filter-Matuchin ratio, the asymmetry of the brow arch. The faces were not similar. They were the same face, same individual, rendered independently, 11 weeks apart. Once from imagination, on a February morning in her home studio. Once from the verbal descriptions of two people who had seen a man commit a crime in an interview room in a county precinct. She went back through the sketchbook from the beginning. The face appeared 7 times across the 11 weeks preceding the interviews in different positions, different orientations. In some entries, a partial sketch, and in 2 entries, a fully resolved portrait. The earliest appearance was January 17th, the 6th day of the sketchbook, which meant she had begun drawing this face within the first week of the year. 11 weeks before she knew his name or his crime or his features from the description of anyone who had stood across a room from him in the dark. She reported the composite to the department with the note that the witnesses' descriptions had been internally consistent and that she had high confidence in the accuracy of the final image. She did not mention the sketchbook. The suspect was identified and arrested 6 weeks later. His photograph matched both the composite and the 7 sketchbook entries in every structural measurement she applied to the comparison. She has continued keeping her journal. She checks the new sketchbook every few days now in the way she did not before. Not anxiously, not with dread, but with the careful, professional attention of someone who has learned that the images she makes before, she knows why she is making them have a reliability she does not fully understand and cannot fully trust but cannot dismiss, because the alternative is dismissing evidence, and she is too well trained for that. She has not told anyone what she found in sketchbook 23. She keeps the page beside the composite in a sealed envelope in the back of the current book. And when she opens a new sketchbook, she transfers the envelope. And she draws whatever her hand decides to draw, and she pays attention. Thomas Briggs had worked overnight security at the Harwick Regional Museum for 6 years, which was a job that suited him in every practical sense. He was a night-oriented person who found the silence of the museum between midnight and 6 deeply comfortable. He was thorough in the manner of someone who understood that thorough was the entire substance of the job rather than a feature of it. And he had never in 6 years experienced anything on an overnight shift that required more from him than the standard discipline of a person doing a careful, conscientious job alone in a large building. The Harwick had 11 galleries on 2 floors and a basement archive, and Thomas walked the full circuit every 90 minutes without variation, a habit he had developed in his first month that had become involuntary. The way the route and the timing had absorbed themselves into his body so completely that he could complete the walk while his mind was elsewhere and arrive. Back at the security desk with accurate impressions of every gallery's state without being fully conscious that he had gathered them. Gallery 7 was the Victorian collection portraiture primarily. the oils and gilt category of work that appeals to a specific type of collector and visitor in which the museum's overnight staff had. Over the years, developed the kind of informal humor about that people develop around things they are slightly uncomfortable with without wanting to admit it. The portraits in Gallery 7 were large, well executed, and occupied by subjects who had been painted with the specific Victorian-era technique that places the eyes in a relationship with the viewer that does not resolve cleanly at the edges of the room, the effect commonly described as eyes that follow you, which is an optical function of technique rather than anything stranger, which Thomas knew and had known for 6 years, and which had never been anything other than a mild curiosity until the Thursday in October when he completed his 2 a.m. round and wrote in his shift log, without particular emphasis, that the portrait in the center of Gallery 7's north wall appeared to be positioned differently than he recalled from the midnight round. Not dramatically differently, a matter of degrees in the angle of the seated subject's body. The direction in which the painted hands rested in the painted lap, but differently, with enough specificity that he cross-referenced it against the log entries from prior nights and found that he had made a similar notation twice before, once in August and once in September, both times in the 2 a.m. entry, both times describing a minor positional shift in the same portrait, a full-length oil, approximately 5 feet by 3, depicting an unnamed Victorian-era man of middle age, seated in a carved chair against a deep burgundy background. Catalogued only as unknown gentleman, circa 1874, acquisition donor unknown. Thomas reported the notation to the museum's facilities coordinator the following morning, framing it as a possible issue with the mounting hardware. A canvas on a wall mount can shift under temperature fluctuation, and the climate control systems in the Victorian gallery were older and less stable than those in the rest of the building. The coordinator sent a maintenance technician who checked the mounting and reported it secure. Thomas continued logging the observations. By December, he had 9 entries describing positional variations in the unknown gentleman, all during the 2 a.m. circuit, all minor, and he had requested twice more that the mounting be inspected and had been told twice more that the hardware was secure. On the 4th of January, he decided to test the observation directly. Instead of walking the full circuit, completed the midnight round normally, and then returned to Gallery 7 and stood in the doorway and watched the portrait continuously from 12:15 until 2 o'clock. For 1 hour and 45 minutes, the portrait was exactly as he had last seen it. The unknown gentleman seated in his carved chair, hands in lap, head at its familiar slight forward angle, the eyes holding their standard not quite resolved relationship with the viewer's position. At 1:58 a.m., Thomas shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, and the floor of Gallery 7 produced the small creak it always produced at the threshold of the room under pressure from the right side. And in the 2 seconds during which his attention was redirected to the sound, and his weight was redistributing, and his eyes were not on the portrait, something changed. He looked up. The unknown gentleman was now facing forward, not the 3/4 angle the portrait had held for as long as Thomas had worked in the building, not the slight leftward inclination documented in the acquisition photograph. He pulled up on his phone and compared on the spot, but fully forward. The seated body squared to the viewer, the painted hands repositioned with the left hand now gripping the arm of the painted chair with the knuckles rendered white, which Thomas was certain had not been in the portrait before, and which he photographed on his phone in the gallery's low overnight, lighting before completing the rest of his circuit and returning to the security desk. He submitted the photographs with his shift report that morning. The museum's director reviewed them and requested that the conservator assigned to the Victorian collection examine the portrait, which the conservator did the following week, in the conservator's report, a copy of which Thomas kept because he had specifically asked for one, stated that the portrait showed evidence of overpainting in at least 2 areas consistent with the compositional changes Thomas had documented, and that the overpainting appeared to have been applied at a date the conservator was not able to determine precisely, but described as not recent and not original, meaning someone had altered the portrait at some point between its creation in 1874 and the present, and the alterations had been made with enough technical skill to have gone unnoticed in standard curatorial review. The director thanked Thomas for his diligence, told him the portrait would undergo further analysis, and moved unknown gentleman into archive storage, pending the conservator's full report. Thomas has not seen the portrait since. He's not asked about the conservator's further findings because he has decided, pragmatically, that there is a version of those findings he would prefer not to receive. He still works the overnight shift. He still walks the Gallery 7 circuit every 90 minutes. The space where unknown gentlemen used to hang is now occupied by a botanical watercolor from the 1920s. And Thomas looks at it each round with the specific, measured attention of someone who has learned that what a painting shows you in passing and what it shows you when you stay are not always the same thing, and that the difference between those 2 images is information that once received cannot be unfiled. Darnell Weiss had worked telecommunications infrastructure for 17 years, the last 11 for the same regional utility as a field technician specializing in legacy copper network, maintenance, the underground and pole-mounted telephone lines that predated fiber by decades, and that still served a thinning population of rural customers who had never upgraded or had no upgrade available to them, and whose continued service the utility was contractually obligated to maintain as part of its operating license. It was not glamorous work, and it was not complicated work. But it was work Darnell was genuinely good at, in the way of someone whose technical intuition had been built from years of physical contact with the infrastructure rather than from documentation alone. He could identify a degraded junction by the sound the line made under test tone, could read a fault signature and impedance data with the accuracy of someone who had seen enough of them to internalize the pattern without consulting the manual, could find a buried line in an unmapped section of rural terrain using the combination of historical survey records and a good sense of how the crews who laid these lines 40 years ago tended to route them around natural obstacles. It was this last skill that took him to the Collins Road Junction in a rural section of the county on a Wednesday morning in March to track a fault in a line segment that the system had flagged as producing anomalous readings, not a deadline, not a clear fault, but an impedance profile that the diagnostic software described as inconsistent and that Darnell's experience told him meant a physical anomaly somewhere in the ground, a splice issue or a water intrusion or a section of jacket that had compromised without fully failing. He located the junction box at the roadside, confirmed it against the routing map, opened it, tested the active pairs, and found the fault in the 3rd pair within 20 minutes, a splice block that had oxidized and needed replacement. Standard work. Done in 45 minutes with the equipment in his truck. He was packing up when the signal meter he had left connected to the box registered an active carrier tone on a pair that the routing map listed as decommissioned. part of a service route that had been taken out of operation in 1983 when the customer addresses it served had been absorbed into a different exchange. A decommissioned pair should carry nothing. Dead copper in a sealed junction carries no tone, no signal, no impedance, reading worth noting. This pair had a carrier tone with the specific, stable waveform of a live service line, not line noise, not bleed from an adjacent pair, but the clean and deliberate signal of a line waiting to be used. Darnell tested it twice. He ran the signal back through his meter's logging function and confirmed it was not an artifact of the equipment. He cross-referenced it against the junction documentation on his tablet and confirmed the pair was listed as physically disconnected at both the exchange end and the customer end in 1983. He sat in his truck for a moment with the logging data on his screen, and then made the decision that any experienced technician with a functioning curiosity would make in the same situation. He connected his test handset to the live decommissioned pair and listened. There was silence first, not the silence of a dead line, but the silence of a line with termination. A line that was connected on the other end to something that was present, not absent. And then a sound that he sat with for approximately 10 seconds. Before his hand moved to remove the handset from the pair, which was the breathing of a person, not mechanical, not signal artifact, not the phonemic approximation of breathing that degraded audio processing can produce breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone who is holding a handset to their own ear and waiting on the other end of a copper line that had been physically disconnected from both its endpoints in 1983. In a section of rural county where the map showed no structure at the routing terminus of that pair within a mile in either direction, Darnell removed the handset. He closed the junction box. He completed his job ticket as normal and did not note the decommissioned pair's carrier tone in the service report because he could. Not note it without triggering an investigation that would require him to explain what he had heard. And he did not know how to explain what he had heard in a way that survived the scrutiny of a technical review. He drove back to the depot and submitted the job ticket and went home. He has driven past the Collins Road junction on his regular route every week since and has not stopped. He has thought about the breathing on that line more than he wants to admit, not the fact of it, which is disturbing enough, but the specific quality of it. Because in 17 years of connecting test handsets to telephone lines in rural junctions, he has heard a great deal of what degraded copper audio does when it is trying to produce a signal and failing. And what he heard on that pair on that Wednesday morning in March was not failure, was not artifact, was not the infrastructure trying and coming up short. It was patience. The particular steady rhythm of a person who has been holding a line open for a very long time and has not yet decided to give up on the possibility that someone will eventually answer. Petra Vasquez had been a licensed practical nurse in palliative and hospice care for 12 years. Which is the kind of nursing that requires a specific orientation toward the end of life, not detachment, which does not actually serve patients or families well, in which good palliative nurses learn quickly to relinquish as a defense, but a trained ability to remain present with people in the final stage of their lives without being consumed by the proximity of that stage, to hold space for dying without losing the capacity to function within it. Petra was good at this in a way that her colleagues recognized, and her patients' families expressed gratitude for, in the specific terms people use when they mean that the nurse was still fully human in a context that can erode humanity. She had worked for 7 of her 12 years at Calverton Hospice, a 24-bed inpatient facility in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. And she knew the building the way you know any place you have inhabited through every season and every shift and every configuration. The difficult emotion that a place absorbs over years of being a site of endings. She knew which corridors carried sound poorly. She knew which rooms had window light that arrived in the early morning in a way that patients found comforting. She knew room 14. Room 14 was one of the 6 single-occupancy rooms on the second floor, identical in dimensions and furnishing to the other 5, differentiated only by its position at the end of the corridor and the specific westward orientation of its window, which meant the afternoon light in that room had a quality the others lacked, low and amber in the final hours of the day. The kind of light that people who work with the dying sometimes describe, carefully and without attribution, as appropriate. Petra had cared for patients in room 14 across 7 years without registering anything about the room that distinguished it from the others, until a conversation with her colleague Yolanda in the break room on a November evening during a shared overnight shift. A conversation that began casually as shift change talk and arrived, without either of them intending it to. At a specific observation that Yolanda made in the tentative, tested way people raise things they are not sure how to raise, she said that in her experience, patients in room 14, in the final hours of consciousness, had a tendency to say a name she didn't recognize. And she had heard it often enough, not always, not from every patient, but consistently enough to notice that she had begun to pay attention to it. The name was Clara. Petra was quiet for a moment, and then said that she had noticed the same thing, framed the same way. Not from every patient, not as an absolute, but with a frequency that exceeded what could be attributed to coincidence in a facility where patients came from varied backgrounds with varied personal histories in which a woman named Clara might or might not appear. They compared notes across the next 20 minutes and found that both of them had individually logged 12 instances across their respective time in the facility, not in a formal record, but in the specific, informal memory that nurses accumulate about the patterns of their work of a patient in room 14 in their final conscious. Hours speaking the name Clara, sometimes once. Sometimes in a repeated murmur, always without the context of a sentence, always in the register of address rather than reference. The way you speak a name when the person it belongs to is in the room with you, rather than in a memory. They looked the name up in every direction they could think of, the facility's patient records going back 20 years, the staff directories across the building's operational history, the administrative records of the facility's founding and construction in the early 1990s, and found no Clara, whose presence in the building's history could account for the frequency and specificity of what they were both observing. They found one record, a patient named Clara Mendez, admitted in 2003, who had died in room 14 in March of that year. One patient, 2 decades prior, whose name matched the name being spoken, sometimes with the specific quality of a greeting, by patients who had been in the room since, with no possible knowledge of who had been there before them. Petra sat with this for a long time, and then made the professional decision that the appropriate response was continued. Observation rather than escalation, which was how she came to be standing at the doorway of room 14 at 3:17 on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks later, running the final check of her shift rounds, looking at a patient named Harold, 81 years old, in the terminal stage of a pulmonary condition. 2 days from the end of his life by the estimate of the attending physician, when Harold turned his head slowly toward the far corner of the room, the corner away from the window, and said clearly and with the full force of whatever consciousness remained to him, the name Clara, in the tone of address, in the exact register she and Yolanda had described to each other in the break room in November. Petra stood in the doorway and noted this, and was recording it mentally in the careful, professional way she had been trained to observe and note. And then Harold turned his head further and looked directly at her, not toward the doorway in general, but at her specifically, at her face in the frame of the door, with eyes that were clear and focused and tracking, and he said, quietly and without confusion and without any of the disorientation that characterized most of his conscious moments in those final days that she said she has been waiting. Petra completed her rounds and submitted her shift notes and drove home in the early morning in the specific silence of a person who is not afraid exactly, but who is paying a different quality of attention to the world than they were paying before, to the corners of rooms, to the spaces that settle into stillness when no one is officially occupying them, to the particular way that certain places accumulate a history that the people who pass through them can feel without being able to name. She still works room 14. She has not stopped, and she will not stop. Because the work is what it is, and the patients are who they are, and Clara, whoever she is or was or has become in that westward room with the amber afternoon light, has given no one in 12 years of observations any reason at all to be afraid. Only to understand that the room holds more than the people currently checked into it, and that when you stand in the doorway at 3 in the morning and the patient looks at you and tells you someone has been waiting, the correct and most human response is not to run, but to say quietly and professionally, "I know, I am here," and to mean it. 5 stories. 5 ordinary lives fractured by a moment nobody planned for and nobody recovered from completely, not because what they encountered destroyed them, because it finished the version of themselves that was capable of the uncomplicated comfort of not knowing. The lighthouse keeper who kept watch past his time, face drawn before the crime. The gentleman in the portrait who learned to move, the breathing on the dead copper line, the names spoken in the amber room. These are the stories that were supposed to end with the people who lived them. They didn't. They ended here with you tonight. Subscribe to True Terror Files Official. We post every single night, and what is waiting in tomorrow's queue is already listening for you. Drop a comment telling me which of the 5 reached through the screen and found you. And when you close this out, before the light comes back on, ask yourself which corner of the room you didn't look at. Good night. We will see you in the dark.